The sun over John F. Kennedy International Airport was not a gentle warmth. It was a blinding, relentless glare that turned the tarmac into a shimmering desert of heat and jet fuel. It was a Tuesday afternoon, sharp and high contrast, the kind of day where the sky is a painful, impossible blue. Inside Terminal 4, the air conditioning hummed with a desperate, mechanical exertion, fighting against the body heat of thousands of travelers moving like a tide through the corridors of steel and glass. For Christie, this terminal was a purgatory. At 25, Christie sat on her battered, second-hand suitcase near Gate B32, her knees pulled up to her chest to avoid the endless stream of rolling luggage passing by. She was invisible in the way that people without money often are in spaces designed for luxury. She wore a beige trench coat that had been mended 3 times at the hem, and her shoes were sensible, scuffed flats that had walked too many miles on too many pavements. But if anyone had bothered to look past the frayed fabric, they would have seen eyes of startling intelligence, dark, observant, and currently scanning the pages of a dense, heavy textbook on advanced fluid dynamics. She wasn't a student, not anymore. She was a brilliant mind that had been priced out of the academy. Christie was self-taught, devouring libraries by night while working double shifts at a diner by day. Today, she was gambling everything she had on a standby ticket to London for a scholarship interview she had miraculously secured. It was a one-way ticket to a possibility, bought with 6 months of tips. She checked her watch, a cheap plastic thing that ticked too loudly. The flight was overbooked. Her name was at the bottom of the standby list. The anxiety in her chest was a tight, cold knot, threatening to unravel her composure. She needed this seat. She needed to leave the stagnation of her life behind. Some collisions leave a mark, others change the trajectory entirely. The atmosphere at the gate shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration. The low murmur of complaints and tired conversations suddenly hushed, replaced by the rustle of heads turning. Julian Montgomery was walking down the concourse. He didn't walk like a passenger. He walked with the easy, predatory grace of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. He was wearing the pristine, navy blue uniform of a captain for Montgomery Aviation, the gold stripes on his epaulettes catching the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was tall, his presence commanding, with a face that belonged on a magazine cover but was currently set in a mask of professional focus. Julian wasn't just the pilot. He was the Montgomery in Montgomery Aviation. He was a billionaire who had inherited an empire but chose to spend his days in the cockpit because the sky was the only place where people didn't ask him for money. He loved the physics of flight, the absolute truth of aerodynamics. He flew because up there, the rules were simple: lift, drag, thrust, weight. Down here, everything was messy. He was heading toward the jetway, his mind already running through the pre-flight checklist, when a sudden commotion broke his concentration. A businessman, rushing and talking loudly on his phone, clipped the edge of a suitcase near the wall. The suitcase tipped over. It was Christie's. The impact sent her open textbook flying. It hit the polished terrazzo floor, sliding across the aisle, and coming to a rest right at the shine of Julian's black leather shoe. Christie scrambled up, her face flushing with humiliation. "I'm sorry," she stammered, rushing forward, ignoring the businessman who hadn't even stopped. "I'm sorry, I was in the way." Julian stopped. He looked down at the book at his feet. He expected a romance novel, or maybe a travel guide. He saw a diagram of a wing foil and margins filled with handwritten calculus. The handwriting was cramped, frantic, and brilliant. It was correcting the textbook's equation for drag coefficient. He crouched down. The movement was fluid, unexpected for a man of his stature. He picked up the book before Christie could reach it. "You adjusted the Reynolds number," Julian said. His voice was deep, a rich baritone that cut through the noise of the terminal. He looked at the margin note. "Why?" Christie froze. She looked up, way up, into eyes that were a piercing, intelligent green. She realized with a jolt that this was the captain, because the author didn't account for the variable density at high altitudes. Christie answered, her voice trembling but her conviction absolute. The formula assumes a standard atmosphere. It's theoretical, not practical. Julian looked at her. He really looked at her. He saw the frayed coat, the exhausted posture, the desperate grip she had on her suitcase. But mostly, he saw the mind that had casually corrected a doctoral-level physics problem while sitting on the floor of a crowded airport. "Who are you?" Julian asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was genuine curiosity, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. "I'm nobody," Christie whispered, snatching the book from his hand, terrified she had offended the man who controlled her fate. "I'm just waiting for a seat." "On my plane?" Julian asked, standing up, towering over her. "If a seat opens up," she said, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. "I'm on standby." Julian stared at her for a heartbeat longer than was polite. He saw the desperation in her amber eyes, a hunger that he recognized. It was the same hunger he felt for the sky, the need to be somewhere else, somewhere higher. "Captain Montgomery, we're ready for boarding," the gate agent called out, her voice breaking the spell. Julian didn't smile. He nodded once at Christie, a sharp, precise acknowledgement of an equal. "The author is wrong about the turbulence, too," Julian said softly. "But you probably already figured that out." He turned and walked through the jetway door, disappearing into the belly of the machine. Christie stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs, clutching her book. She didn't know that the captain wasn't just a pilot. She didn't know he owned the plane. And she certainly didn't know that as he walked into the cockpit, Julian Montgomery was picking up the phone to the gate agent, about to make sure that the girl with the calculus in her margins didn't stay on the standby list. The accident of the fallen book had just set a new course, and neither of them knew where it would land. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, slicing through Christie's anxiety like a blade. "Passenger Christie Ward, please approach the podium." Christie froze. Her stomach dropped, a heavy stone of dread settling in her gut. She assumed the worst, that the standby list had cleared, but not for her. She gripped the handle of her battered suitcase, her knuckles white, preparing to beg, to explain, to offer to sit in the galley if she had to. She walked to the desk, her chin held high, bracing for the rejection that life had taught her to expect. "Ms. Ward," the agent said, typing rapidly. She didn't look pitying. She looked confused. "There has been a change. You've been cleared." Christie let out a breath that shook her entire frame. "Thank you." "Oh, thank you. I can take the middle seat in the back. It's fine." "Seat 1A," the agent corrected, handing her a boarding pass printed on heavy, distinct stock. "First class. Compliments of the flight deck." Christie took the ticket. She stared at it. First class. The world behind the curtain. She looked toward the jetway, remembering the piercing green eyes of the captain. He hadn't just corrected her physics, he had rewritten her probability. She boarded the plane. The transition was jarring. She moved from the chaotic noise of a terminal into a sanctuary of hushed luxury. Seat 1A was a leather throne by the window. The air here smelled different, citrus, leather, and silence. Christie stowed her worn bag, conscious of how it clashed with the pristine surroundings, and sat down. She felt like an imposter, a smudge on a masterpiece waiting to be wiped away. We often feel smallest when we are given the most space. The flight to London was smooth, the sky outside a canvas of deepening indigo. Christie didn't recline the seat. She opened her textbook, diving back into the safety of numbers. Equations didn't judge. Variables didn't care about your bank account. 2 hours into the flight, the curtain separating the galley from the cabin parted. Julian Montgomery stepped out. He had removed his jacket. His tie was loosened slightly, and his white shirt was crisp against the dim cabin lighting. He held a coffee cup, his expression unreadable. He walked straight to seat 1A. Christie felt his presence before she saw him. It was a displacement of air, a gravitational pull. She looked up from her book. "The Reynolds number," Julian said quietly, leaning against the bulkhead near her seat. "You were right. The textbook assumes a vacuum stability that doesn't exist at 30,000 feet. Christie replied softly, "Most things look stable until you put them under pressure." Julian smiled. It wasn't the polite, corporate smile he used for investors. It was small, genuine, and touched his eyes. He sat on the ottoman at her feet. For the next hour, the billionaire pilot and the diner waitress didn't speak of money or London. They spoke of lift and drag. They argued about Bernoulli's principle. She realized he wasn't just a pilot. He was a man starving for a conversation that wasn't a transaction. "Captain," a flight attendant interrupted, her voice tight with disapproval. "ATC is requesting an update on the headwind." The bubble burst. Julian stood up, the mask of command sliding back into place. "Good luck in London, Christie," he said, before walking back to the cockpit. When the plane landed at Heathrow, the reality of the ground rushed back in. Christie gathered her things, exhausted but buzzing with the memory of the conversation. She stepped into the arrival hall, expecting to navigate the unknown city alone. "Ms. Ward." She stopped. A man in a black chauffeur's uniform was holding a sign with her name. Next to him stood Julian, now wearing a sharp civilian suit, surrounded by assistants. He looked like the billionaire now. Distant, important, but he was looking at her. "My driver will take you to your hotel," Julian said, ignoring his team. "It's on my way." "I don't have a hotel," Christie confessed, the shame burning her cheeks. "I have a hostel booking." The woman with the tablet sneered slightly. "Not anymore," Julian said. He turned to his assistant. "Book her a room at the Savoy. Put it on my personal account." Christie stepped back, her pride flaring up instantly. "No, I can't accept that," she protested, clutching her book tighter. "That is too much, and I can't pay you back." Julian looked at her, seeing the fierce independence in her eyes. "It's not charity, Christie, it's logistics," he insisted, his voice gentle but firm. "The city is big, and you need to rest before you change the world. Please." Christie hesitated, but exhausted and cornered, she nodded slowly. But as she stepped toward the vehicle, she saw the flash of paparazzi cameras through the glass doors. They weren't photographing her, they were photographing him with her. She had entered his life by accident, but as the flashbulbs popped, she realized she had just walked into a spotlight she wasn't prepared to survive. London was a city of gray stone and hushed judgments, a stark contrast to the blinding clarity of the sky over New York. Christie stood in the corridor of Imperial College, clutching her portfolio. She felt electric. She felt ready. She had spent the night at the Savoy not sleeping in the high-thread count sheets, but pacing the plush carpet, rehearsing her thesis on aerodynamic efficiency. She was prepared to defend her mind against the best academics in the world. She entered the interview room. It was an oak-paneled chamber that smelled of old books and centuries of exclusion. 3 professors sat behind a long table. They didn't ask her to sit. "Ms. Ward," the lead interviewer said. He was a man with spectacles and a mouth drawn in a thin, disapproving line. "Your application was impressive. Self-taught. Remarkable test scores." "Thank you, sir," Christie said, stepping forward. "I prepared a presentation on—" "However," he interrupted, sliding a folded newspaper across the polished wood, "we value academic integrity above all else at Imperial. We educate scholars, not socialites looking for a pastime." Christie looked down. Her breath hitched. On the front page of the Daily Mail, a grainy but unmistakable photo stared back. It was her and Julian outside Heathrow. He was guiding her into the car, his hand protectively on the small of her back. The headline screamed, "Montgomery's new mile-high fling, the billionaire pilot and the mystery brunette." I don't understand, Christie whispered, her face burning. What does this have to do with my physics aptitude? It suggests that your sudden appearance on the scholarship shortlist might be due to external influence, the professor said coldly. We received a call this morning from Mr. Montgomery's office. A generous offer to endow a new laboratory in conjunction with your acceptance. The room spun. The floor seemed to dissolve beneath her sensible shoes. He called you, Christie choked out. It was very subtle, the professor sneered. But we are not a charity for the mistresses of billionaires. We cannot accept a student whose merit is subsidized by a checkbook. It would compromise the institution. Christie didn't present her thesis. She didn't argue about Reynolds numbers. She turned around, the taste of ash in her mouth, and walked out. The dream she had worked for, the validation she had starved herself to afford, had been incinerated not by her lack of talent, but by the very connection she thought was a miracle. The sky is the only place where we are judged by our lift, not our luggage. But on the ground, the luggage is all they see. She didn't go back to the hostel. She went straight to the Montgomery Aviation headquarters in the financial district. She still had the visitor pass Julian had given her just in case. She used it now, bypassing the security guards who smirked as she walked by, recognizing her from the tabloids. She found Julian in his corner office. He was standing by the window, looking out at the London skyline, looking like a titan of industry. He turned when she burst in, a smile forming on his lips, a smile that died instantly when he saw her face. "Christie!" He stepped forward. "How was the interview?" "I've been waiting to hear." "You called them," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, it was shattered. Julian paused. He didn't deny it. He adjusted his cufflinks, the defensive posture of a man caught doing what he thought was right. "I spoke to the dean. I wanted to ensure they gave you a fair shake. I know how these institutions work, Christie. They look at your background, your lack of formal schooling, and they dismiss you. I wanted to level the playing field." "You didn't level it," Christie whispered, tears finally spilling over. "You bought it. You offered them a laboratory. I offered an endowment." Julian argued, closing the distance between them. "To support the program. To make sure they knew you had backing. I was trying to protect you." "I didn't need protection," Christie screamed, the sound echoing off the glass walls. "I needed you to believe I was smart enough to do it alone. You sat on that plane, Julian, and you told me I was brilliant. You looked me in the eye and treated me like an equal. But the moment we landed, you treated me like a charity case. I was trying to help." Julian shouted back, his frustration boiling over. "You have no idea how this world works. Merit isn't enough when you're invisible. I gave you a spotlight. You gave me a price tag." Christie countered, throwing the newspaper onto his desk. "They rejected me, Julian. Not because I wasn't smart enough, but because they think I'm your mistake. Your baggage." She looked at him, her amber eyes burning with a mixture of love and devastation. "I spent my whole life being poor," she said, her voice shaking. "But I had my mind. It was the one thing that was mine, the one thing no one could buy. And you took that from me. You made it look like I needed a billionaire to open the door." Julian went pale. The realization hit him like a physical blow. In his arrogance, in his desire to smooth the path for her, he had reinforced the very barrier she was trying to break. He had tried to use his gravity to lift her, but instead, he had crushed her under his weight. "Christie, I can fix this," Julian pleaded, reaching for her. "I can call the board. I can." "Don't," she said, stepping back, recoiling from his touch. "Don't spend another dime on me. Every time you open your wallet, you erase a little bit more of who I am." She looked at the luxury office, the view, the men who had everything but understood nothing about the dignity of the struggle. "I'm going back to New York," she said quietly. "I'm going back to the diner. Because at least there, when I earn $1, I know it's mine." "Christie, please," Julian whispered, the panic rising in his chest. "Don't go. You're the only real thing that's happened to me in years." "That's the problem, Julian," she said, her hand on the doorknob. "I'm real, and you're just expensive." She opened the door and walked out. She walked past the secretaries, past the security, and out into the gray London rain that had finally begun to fall. She left him alone in his tower of glass, a man who could navigate through the wildest storms in the sky, but who had just crashed the most important thing on the ground. The separation was absolute, leaving a silence in the office that no amount of money could fill. She was gone, and this time there was no standby list to bring her back. 3 weeks. That was how long it took for Christie's life to shrink back to its original size. The diner in Queens was exactly as she had left it, smelling of stale grease, burnt coffee, and resignation. The neon sign in the window still buzzed with an irritating flicker, a metronome marking the passing of time she was wasting. She wiped down the counter with a gray rag, the motion repetitive and numbing. The brief, blinding flight into the stratosphere with Julian Montgomery felt like a fever dream, a hallucination induced by altitude and exhaustion. She had stopped reading physics. The textbooks were stacked in the corner of her small apartment, turned toward the wall. Every time she looked at an equation, she felt the sting of humiliation, the reminder that her mind wasn't enough currency to buy a seat at the table. It was 2 a.m. on a humid Tuesday. The diner was empty, save for a truck driver dozing in the back booth. Christie was counting the till, her fingers stained with ink and grease. The bell above the door chimed. Christie didn't look up immediately. "Kitchen's closed," she called out, her voice flat. "Coffee only. Coffee is fine." The voice was low, familiar, and stripped of all its armor. Christie's hands froze over the dollar bills. She looked up slowly. Julian was standing there, but he wasn't the captain in the pristine uniform, nor was he the billionaire in the Italian suit. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair windblown, dark circles carved deep under his green eyes. He looked like a man who had walked from Manhattan. He looked like a man who hadn't slept since she left London. "You have some nerve," Christie whispered, the anger rising in her chest like bile. "Did you buy the diner, Julian? Is that why you're here? To gentrify my misery?" "I didn't buy anything," Julian said, walking to the counter. He didn't sit. He stood, keeping the barrier between them, respecting her territory. "I came to bring you this." He placed a thick, bound document on the laminate counter. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a contract. It was her portfolio, the one she had left in the trash bin outside his office in London. "I pulled it out," Julian admitted, his voice rough. "And I read it. Not just the margins. All of it." "Go away, Julian," Christie snapped, turning her back to him to scrub a stain that didn't exist. "I don't need your pity. I'm doing fine. I'm making rent." "It's not pity," Julian said, his voice rising with a sudden, desperate intensity. "It's awe, Christie. And it's jealousy." Christie stopped scrubbing. She turned around slowly. "Jealousy?" "Yes," Julian confessed, looking her in the eye. "I was jealous. You sat on that floor in JFK and fixed an equation that I had accepted as fact for 10 years. You have a mind that sees the aerodynamics of the world, and you built it yourself. I inherited my empire. I inherited my planes. I inherited my name. Everything I have was given to me." He ran a hand through his hair, looking at the diner around them, seeing the cage she was living in. "When I called the college, I wasn't trying to buy you a seat because I thought you couldn't earn it. I did it because I was terrified that if you had to struggle, you might give up, and the world couldn't afford to lose your mind. But mostly," he paused, his voice breaking, "mostly, I was afraid that if you made it on your own, you wouldn't need me anymore. I wanted to be the one who gave you the wings, because I knew I couldn't be the wind." Christie stared at him. The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. He hadn't acted out of arrogance, but out of a profound insecurity. He was a bird born in a golden cage, marveling at a hawk that had learned to fly in a storm. "You hurt me," Christie whispered, the anger dissolving into a dull ache. "You made me feel small." "I know," Julian said, "and I can't undo it. I can't fix the interview. But I can tell you the truth." He pushed the portfolio toward her. "I didn't come here to offer you money, Christie. I quit the board of the scholarship fund. I told them to keep their endowment." "Then why are you here?" "Because there is a problem with the new turbine design for the Montgomery 700 series," Julian said, shifting gears, speaking to her intellect, not her heart. "The engineers say it's a materials issue. They say the drag at Mach 0.85 is unavoidable." He pulled a folded napkin from his pocket, a cheap diner napkin covered in black ink. He unfolded it and placed it on top of her portfolio. "I spent 3 days looking at your notes on Reynolds numbers," Julian said, "and I think they're wrong. I think you found the answer in the margins of a textbook." Christie looked at the napkin. It was a sketch of an intake valve, redrawn with the variable density she had argued for on the plane. It was an invitation. Not to a dinner, not to a date, but to a problem. "I don't work for you, Julian," she said, though her eyes were already tracing the lines of the sketch. "I know," Julian replied, "and I'm not offering you a job as a favor. I'm offering you a blind audition. The engineering team is holding a design charrette on Monday. All submissions are anonymous. No names, no backgrounds, just the math." He looked at her, his green eyes blazing with a challenge. "If you submit this, if you fix the engine, they will hire you. Not because you're my mistake, not because of a check, but because you are the smartest person in the room. And I won't be there. I'm stepping down as CEO to fly full-time. I won't be your boss. I'll just be the pilot trusting his life to your design. The sky is the only place where we are judged by our lift, not our luggage." Christie looked at the man standing in her diner. He was offering her the one thing she had never truly been given, a fair fight. He was removing himself from the equation so she could solve it on her own. It was a sacrifice of his control, a surrender of his need to be the hero. "And if I fail?" Christie asked, her voice trembling. "You won't," Julian said with absolute conviction. "But if you do, you'll fail on your own terms, and I'll still be waiting outside to buy you a coffee. Not as a billionaire, just as a guy who knows you're worth the wait." He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't try to kiss her. He simply tapped the portfolio. "Monday at 9 a.m. Building 4. Don't be late." He turned and walked toward the door. Christie watched him go. He looked exhausted, stripped of his ego, and entirely real. She looked down at the napkin, at the math that bridged the gap between his world and hers. The pain of the rejection was still there, a bruise on her pride, but beneath it, a spark had reignited. He hadn't come to save her. He had come to remind her that she could save herself. And for the first time since London, Christie felt the turbulence settle, replaced by the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of preparing for takeoff. 7 months later, the Mojave Desert was a cathedral of silence and heat, a vast expanse of ochre earth stretching out to meet a sky so blue it looked painted. This was the proving ground for Montgomery aviation, a place where theory met reality, and where mistakes were measured in smoke and craters. Christie stood on the edge of the tarmac, shielding her eyes against the glare. She wasn't wearing the frayed beige trench coat anymore. She wore a tailored blazer, wind-blown hair tied back with a practical band, and a lanyard around her neck that read, "Lead Engineer, Turbine Division." She wasn't holding a tray of coffee. She was holding a tablet that displayed the live telemetry of the aircraft currently screaming overhead at 30,000 feet. The Montgomery 700 series, the plane with the impossible engine problem, was on its final certification flight, and the engine keeping it aloft was hers. She had won the blind audition. It hadn't been close. When the engineering board reviewed Submission 89, they hadn't seen a waitress from Queens or a college dropout. They had seen a solution so elegant, so mathematically pure, that the chief engineer had reportedly asked if it was written by a computer. Christie had walked into the boardroom 3 days later to claim her work, and for the first time in her life, she hadn't felt like an imposter. She felt like the answer. The roar of the jet engines shifted in pitch, a deep, thrumming growl that vibrated in Christie's chest. The plane banked sharply, a silver dart catching the sun, before aligning for the final approach. Telemetry looks green across the board, the flight director murmured into his headset, standing next to her. Drag coefficient is perfect. It's like the air doesn't even know the plane is there. Christie smiled. It wasn't a smile of relief. It was the smile of someone who trusts the math. The tires kissed the tarmac with a puff of white smoke, the aircraft settling onto the runway with the grace of a bird returning to its nest. As it taxied toward the hangar, the ground crew moved in, but Christie stayed put. She waited for the engines to spool down, for the whine to fade into the desert wind. The mobile stairs were rolled up. The cabin door opened. Julian Montgomery stepped out. He wasn't wearing the suit of a CEO. He had kept his word. He had stepped down from the board, handing the reins of the business to a team of administrators so he could do the one thing he loved, fly. He wore his flight suit, unzipped at the collar, his helmet tucked under his arm. He looked tired, sweaty, and happier than she had ever seen him. He walked down the stairs, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped a few feet from her. The desert wind swirled between them, kicking up dust, but the turbulence that had defined their relationship was gone. "It flies differently," Julian said. His voice was rough, parched from the dry air. "Differently good or differently bad?" Christie asked, crossing her arms, her posture mirroring his confidence. "It flies like it understands the air," Julian replied. He looked at the plane, then back at her. "I've flown 1,000 jets, Christie. But that one didn't fight the wind. It danced with it. It felt like you." "I told you," she said softly. "The Reynolds number was wrong. I just corrected the variable." "You corrected a lot more than that," Julian said. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, but this time there was no power imbalance. He wasn't the billionaire saving the stray. She wasn't the passenger in the cheap coat. They were two professionals standing on the ground they had both conquered. "I didn't know it was your design," Julian confessed, his green eyes searching hers. I hoped. I recognized the logic, but I didn't check the file until the board voted. You did this, Christie. You walked through the door on your own 2 feet. "I had to," Christie whispered. "It was the only way to make the luggage lighter." She reached out and touched the patch on his flight suit, the Montgomery wings. "You gave up the company," she said. "The title, the power, just to fly." "I didn't give up anything real," Julian answered, covering her hand with his. "I gave up the noise. I gave up the illusion that I was important just because my name was on the building. Up there today, realizing that my life was in the hands of the woman who fixed my engine on a diner napkin, that was the first time I felt truly safe. The sky is the only place where we are judged by our lift, not our luggage." "You were right," Christie murmured, repeating the words that had started it all. "The sky doesn't care who we are down here. But you were wrong about one thing, Julian." "What's that?" "You don't have to be in the sky to leave the baggage behind," she said. "You just have to find someone who is willing to help you carry it until you're strong enough to drop it." Julian looked at her, this brilliant, stubborn, beautiful woman who had entered his life as an accident and become the architect of his freedom. He realized that for years he had been flying solo, thinking he was protecting his heart by keeping it at 30,000 feet. But looking at her, he knew he had finally come in for a landing. "I love you, Christie," he said. It wasn't a grand declaration, shouted over the roar of an engine. It was quiet, spoken into the desert silence, as absolute and undeniable as gravity. And I don't want to be the CEO. I don't want to be the billionaire. I just want to be the pilot who comes home to you. Good, Christie smiled, tears finally pricking her amber eyes. Because I have a lot of new designs, and I'm going to need a very good test pilot. He kissed her then, under the vast, open expanse of the Mojave sky. It was a kiss of equals, of shared risk and shared reward. It tasted of dust and victory. They stood together on the tarmac, the silver plane gleaming behind them, a machine built by her mind and flown by his hands. They had started on opposite sides of the cabin curtain, separated by class and circumstance, but they had found their way to the same horizon. Christie Ward had once been a girl waiting on a standby list for a life she couldn't afford. Now, she was the one designing the wings. And Julian Montgomery, the man who had owned the airline, finally understood that the most precious thing he possessed wasn't the fleet of jets, but the love of the woman who had taught him that the only way to truly fly is to let go of everything that weighs you down. She had stumbled into his life as a variable he couldn't calculate, never suspecting that she would become the constant that kept his world from falling apart.